Good morning. This is Lecture 3 for Western Civ 1. So for our ninth graders, this is Lecture 3. And in the last lecture, I talked to you about the barbarian invasions, the Germanic invasions of the Roman Empire. And we talked specifically about a leader named Alaric and the Visigoths, that's Western Goths, and how eventually, in 410 AD, they sacked the city of Rome itself. They invaded, went over the walls, got inside, stole valuables, stole food. There was some killing of people, too. It was not as a massacre of the city of the people of Rome, but it was a bad deal. Shook the people of the Roman world to their core that this happened. Just imagine if, some wild people from nowhere took over New York City and stole everything they could from it. It was such a blow to Romans. But I need to give a sort of corrective lecture to correct what might be in your head about these barbarians. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember the Capital One ads with the barbarian hordes they used to have, these shaggy men in big fur coats with big axes and spears and stuff. That's not really what we're talking about. You have to remember what the word barbarian meant in the Greco-Roman world of antiquity, in the Roman world. A barbarian was simply someone who did not speak Greek or Latin as their native tongue. If you didn't speak either of those two languages, you were a barbarian by definition. And that meant as your mother tongue. You might be quite a good speaker of Latin as your second language, but you were still a barbarian if you were raised in a non-Latin speaking home in the Western world. So it turns out that these barbarians were not, wild men barely clothed, covering themselves with skins, living in stick huts or something in the middle of nowhere. These were farming people. These were people who lived in villages before they got displaced by the Hunnish invasions that pushed them out of their own original homeland. They were farming folk. They were settled people. They were not great nations. They were smaller bands. They usually had a chieftain, but that chieftain was largely a war leader. Their laws were customary laws, so they weren't like the Romans. They weren't city folk with highly elaborate government systems and law codes and all that, but they were not wild men, okay? You shouldn't think that when I say barbarian invasions. They were people who wanted a home, who wanted farms to live on, who wanted to make settled lives for their families, and their kids could grow up and have peaceful lives. That's what they wanted. But the Romans, of course, would not give that to them. They wanted to keep them out of the empire entirely, so they kept them on the far side of the Danube River for far too long. Things got desperate for them there. They were being abused, forced to sell their kids into slavery just to get dog meat to eat. And the desperation drove them to violence. You could almost think of it as an armed protest against the injustices of the Roman government, in a way, than a standard military invasion of one nation by another. But the effect, of course, was the same as a military invasion. The barbarian armies grew and grew, and they were not a peaceful people. I don't want to give you that misimpression the other direction. They were farmers, but they were people who were, had a warrior heritage. They knew how to fight, and they put that into good effect in the course of 40 years of this fight to get a home. Well, after the sacking of Rome, Alaric and his Visigoths went back to what is now France, what the Romans called Gaul, France. And there they extorted from the emperor, finally, the land they wanted. And the Visigoths will settle in what's now France on lands that were taken from Romans. Now, many of these farms were taken from the estates of the wealthy. Think back to a couple of months ago when we were talking about the Gracchi brothers. Remember that? And I talked to you about the latifundia. The latifundia were these great estates, these massive farms, farmed by slave labor. Remember that? How they had acquired these farms because the small farmers were off fighting in the Roman army for months and years at a time, and their families would get behind in their payments, and they would take the land and form these giant estates, these latifundia. Well, that had become the norm throughout the Roman world. There were still small farmers, some, but more and more Roman agriculture was in the hands of these mighty land barons. And so that's where most of the land for the Visigoths came from in Gaul. The wealthy and powerful Romans had to cough it up. And that you can see my dad in the background. Say hello, Pop.
Hello.
No, there you go. That's my father back there. He's doing some chores. These latifundia, the great Romans would provide the land for the Visigoths. Now, once they began to settle, and I can't say the Romans were always 100% on board with this, but they really had no choice. The Germans were there, they were armed, and they even had imperial decrees saying that they were now allies of the Roman people. Technically, what happened was the Visigoths' army was made an ally of Rome and incorporated into the Roman military apparatus. And the land they were receiving was in exchange for their military service. Keep this in mind when we start talking a little later on about feudalism and the rise of the feudal system in Western Europe. It's going to go back to this. You fight for the Roman state, we will give you land to live on to pay you for your willingness to fight. So that's technically what was going on. These allies are part of now the Roman military system, and they're being given land as their compensation for their willingness to fight. Now, one thing, notice, who do you think they're being hired to fight? The Visigoths were being hired to fight other Germans. The Germans are continuing to put pressure on the borders of the Roman world. More and more German tribes are coming in. And the Roman army has shown they can't take them down. They cannot defend the Roman state. They don't have enough men. They don't have enough weapons to defend the Roman state against this onslaught of Germanic tribes. So they recruit the Visigothic Germans to fight the other Germans. Sometimes that will work. Sometimes it will not. A lot of times people do have a certain sympathy for people who are a lot like them. And remember, the Romans often treated these Germans with less than civility. They saw them as occupying armies in Gaul. So, if you're getting the cold shoulder from your Roman neighbors that you're supposed to be defending, and you got some distant cousins who are the ones you're supposed to be fighting, could be a temptation to switch sides, mightn't it? Yeah. And that did definitely happen sometimes. Sometimes the German allies of the Romans would switch in the middle of the battle and join their Germanic brethren they had been fighting, especially if they felt the Romans weren't giving them a fair shake economically or treated them with contempt, which sometimes Roman people did. So that's another, this is a very complicated, fluid time. You get it? You're getting that when I talk to you about this, right? This is the early 400s AD. The early 400s AD. Very complex time as Germans are coming in. Some are settling. Some are still fighting. They're taking land from the Romans at the orders of the Roman government. And how are they living on the ground? Now, this is fascinating. I mentioned to you that the Germans were originally settled people. They lived on farms and so on. Many of them had trading relationships, economic relationships with the Roman Empire before all the chaos began. Latin was spoken by a good number of Germans for that reason. These Germans knew the Romans before they ever invaded the empire. There were kings or chieftains among them who had lived within the Roman Empire for a time. Some of them had served with the Roman army before. So they weren't totally alien at all. They were people who knew what the Romans were about before they invaded the Roman Empire. When the Visigoths settled in Gaul, for example, what they wanted was a Roman life. They wanted a Roman lifestyle. You look at the great chiefs of the Visigoths in Gaul, they built houses just like their Roman neighbors, or in some cases, they moved into Roman houses. And they wanted to live like Romans to the extent they could. They wanted their children to receive educations for the Roman world, just like immigrants who come to the United States today, right? They might very much still value their culture. And oftentimes these Germans are very proud of their German heritage. But they said, the Roman world has a lot of good things. I want my kids to speak perfect Latin. I want my kids to have a fine education in the Roman style. I want my son to maybe be on the city council of the nearby city of our villa someday. Well, that's what they wanted. They wanted to integrate while maintaining a certain degree of German character. This should sound very familiar to us in America today. They wanted to be part of the Roman world. Overwhelmingly, they wanted that. Because there was a lot about Roman life that was better than what they had, and they knew it. So you do have, this interesting blending. For a while, there were laws against intermarriage. The Romans passed laws saying no Roman woman can marry a German man, that kind of thing. But these proved to be impossible to enforce. As the Germans settled in on their new farms, some of them became quite prosperous. And, remember, most marriages are still arranged marriages this time. The love match marriage was still not common. You've got a young daughter, you're a Roman, you've got a daughter, and you look down the road and you see a very prosperous German farmer. You might be thinking, hey, he's got a son about my daughter's marriageable age for my daughter. Maybe I can cut a deal. Maybe my daughter can marry him. And give her financial security. And besides, in our regions, the Germans are running the local government. That was often part of the deal. They got to control the local government, technically on behalf of the Roman emperor, but they were in charge often where they settled. So, they're sitting on top of the local society. So a lot of Roman families wound up marrying off their daughters to the Germans. And so their kids are going to be half German, half Roman. They're going to be native speakers of both languages. Pretty soon, maybe you won't be able to tell the Germans from the Romans. That is precisely what will happen. By the 500s, the people of Gaul are an utterly mixed community. Latin itself, which is still the dominant language, will absorb a lot of Germanic elements, and it will evolve into early French. Okay? So that's an example of what was called Romanization. Romanization. Germans becoming Roman-like. But Romanization really cut both ways. The Germans changed every place they went, right? Immigrants always absorb a lot of the culture of the place they come to, but they leave strong traces behind. A place that's had a good number of immigrants move to it is never the same again. And that's the case with the Western Roman Empire and the Germanic settlement. Be back in Lecture 4 in just a few minutes.